I watched her walk out of my life, smiling, while I carried the last proof of our love inside me. She thought she had won, my husband, my life, everything. But the moment I gave birth to our triplets, everything changed. No one expected the DNA test to reveal the truth that would turn her world upside down, and finally, justice felt like it had a name. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. I never imagined that the day I discovered I was pregnant would also be the day my world started to crumble. My name was Lila, and at the time I was married to Mark, the man I thought I would grow old with. We had been together for 10 years, and our life was ordinary in the most comforting way. Quiet mornings with coffee, shared dreams whispered in the dark, and promises that felt unbreakable. But life has a cruel way of showing you just how fragile those promises can be. I was 6 months along when I first noticed the subtle changes in Mark. He started coming home late, brushing off my questions with distracted smiles or feigned exhaustion. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man I married, the man who held my hand through every loss and every joy, would never betray me. But deep down, something in my gut refused to be silenced. It was a rainy evening when I saw her first. Her name was Vanessa, a woman I had met only a few times socially, always polite, always distant. I never thought much of it until I walked into a boutique Mark had promised me to show me. There she was, standing in the middle of the shop with his hand casually resting on her back. Not a touch that meant nothing, no. It was the kind of touch that carved out a secret space in his heart where I didn't exist. I froze, my mind refusing to let the moment sink in, my heart hammering with a cold realization that my worst fears were real. I confronted him that night. The words tumbled out of me before I could think. "Are you seeing her?" His eyes, usually so warm, were unreadable, like he was trying to hide a storm behind a calm lake. Then he said it, words that felt like glass shards against my ribs. I didn't plan for this to happen, Lila. I didn't want you to find out like this." There was no remorse, only a casual confession, a shrug of inevitability. My life, the life I had imagined with him, shattered in that instant. But I was pregnant, 3 months shy of meeting my babies, and the knowledge that they were hers, every tiny heartbeat, every kick, every flutter of life in my belly kept me tethered to hope, to the belief that some good could exist even in the face of such betrayal. I made a decision then that would define the next year of my life. I would endure for the sake of our children. I would give them everything I could, even if Mark had already given pieces of my heart to someone else. The months grew heavy. Vanessa didn't hide her presence anymore. I started seeing the subtle signs, the extra messages, the lingering looks, the way Mark's laughter had shifted when he was around her. My friends advised me to leave, to cut ties, to protect my sanity. But leaving wasn't simple. I was carrying our future, and leaving meant abandoning part of myself and the life that still had value. One night, exhausted from work and worry, I sat alone in the nursery I had painted in soft pastels, imagining the tiny lives I would soon cradle in my arms. My hand rested on my belly as I whispered to them, promising safety, love, and a life where they would never feel the sting of betrayal that I had endured. And then the phone rang. Mark, his voice unusually soft. "Lila, I think we should talk." I didn't know if it was relief or fear that made me answer. The conversation that followed was a quiet unraveling of our marriage. He admitted that his affair had started before I even knew I was pregnant. He explained away his absence, rationalized his betrayals, and for a moment I felt the flicker of the woman I used to love him as. But deep down, I knew the truth. Love without loyalty was nothing more than an empty shell, and I wasn't ready to be hollowed out. Then came the day my water broke. The hospital was bustling, a flurry of nurses and doctors moving around me while my body trembled from exhaustion and fear. Giving birth was nothing like the romanticized stories I had heard. It was raw, painful, and entirely consuming. Hours passed in a haze of pain and anticipation, and then, against the backdrop of chaos and fear, 3 cries filled the room. My triplets, 2 boys and a girl, were here. Tiny, fragile, perfect. I held them close, feeling a love so fierce it eclipsed every hurt, every betrayal, every sleepless night I had endured. But even in that moment of triumph, the shadow of Vanessa lingered. She had tried to insert herself into my life even here, visiting the hospital under the guise of concern, pretending to care. She smiled at Mark as if she had conquered the world, and part of me wished I could vanish, wished that the universe would punish her audacity. But I was too focused on my children, on the small miracles wrapped in hospital blankets and swaddled in innocence. As the days went by, I watched Mark struggle with his new reality. He was no longer in control, no longer the one orchestrating secrets. The weight of my triplets was not just physical, it was emotional, binding him to a truth he could no longer escape. Vanessa, who had believed herself victorious, began to falter. She tried subtle manipulations, whispered words, insinuated herself into conversations, but I noticed, and more importantly, I did not yield. The breaking point came unexpectedly. A routine pediatric visit ended with a suggestion from the nurse to run a DNA test, just to confirm everything medically. It was a precaution, nothing more. But the results came back, and when they were handed to me, my hands shook and my heart stopped. Vanessa's face, Mark's confessions, every deceit, they all faded against the clarity of undeniable truth. The DNA test revealed what I already suspected in my heart but could not articulate until then. These children were his, yes, but there was another revelation that would forever change the dynamics of our lives. The timing, the paternity, the hidden connections, it all unraveled, exposing not just Mark's betrayal, but Vanessa's intricate web of assumptions and lies. For the first time, she was no longer in control. I saw the shift in her eyes, the moment she realized the world she thought she had won was slipping through her fingers. And in that instant, I understood the power of truth, of patience, of endurance. I had survived the pain, carried life through the most vulnerable moments, and emerged not broken, but resilient. Vanessa's victory had been an illusion, a temporary shadow over the light I had nurtured in my belly. And for my children, for myself, I knew that life would go on. After the DNA results, everything shifted. It wasn't instant and it wasn't dramatic like in the movies, but there was a quiet, undeniable change. Mark's arrogance melted into panic, a subtle guilt that couldn't be hidden even behind his practiced charm. Vanessa, on the other hand, tried desperately to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed mask. She had assumed she had won my life, my marriage, my husband, but the truth had other plans. For weeks after the birth, I barely slept. Caring for triplets was exhausting, and yet every exhaustion-filled night was also a reminder that I had created life that no one could take away from me. Holding my babies close, I often whispered stories into their ears, promising them a life filled with love, honesty, and a family that would protect them. In those moments, I felt a strength I didn't know existed in me, a determination to ensure that no one, not even Mark or Vanessa, could define what our family would be. Mark's attempts to reconcile were clumsy and desperate. He would come home with flowers, with apologies whispered at midnight, hoping I would forgive him, hoping the allure of family life would mask the betrayal. But I wasn't the same woman who had trusted him blindly. I had seen the hidden corners of his life, the side he didn't dare show me for years. Forgiveness didn't come easily. Not for the lies, not for the heartbreak, not for the nearly unbearable weight of his choices. Vanessa, of course, wasn't idle. She tried to insert herself into our world at every turn. Gifts for the babies, calls under the pretense of concern, even comments on social media about new beginnings and finding what you deserve. But I refused to engage. I kept my distance, careful not to let her actions provoke anger that would compromise my own clarity. Her confidence, once so unshakable, now seemed desperate, almost pitiable. She believed she could manipulate reality, but reality, I had learned, had a way of humbling the boldest illusions. One afternoon, Mark and I had a confrontation that changed everything. He tried to corner me in the kitchen, using a tone he thought would sway me. "Lila, don't you see? I'm the one who's lost too. She isn't right for me. You're the mother of my children. I need you." His voice cracked, a mixture of desperation and guilt. But I had nothing left to give him, not as a lover, not as a confidant, and certainly not as a passive participant in a life he had betrayed. "You lost yourself a long time ago, Mark," I said quietly, my hands gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "And you thought she could fill the space that only trust can occupy. But trust isn't replaceable. It can't be borrowed or bought, and it certainly can't be stolen." I wanted him to understand, to feel the gravity of his choices, but I also knew that no words could reverse the damage. The only thing I could control was what came next, how I built a life for my children without letting his mistakes define them. The weeks passed, and slowly the dynamic shifted further. Vanessa began to withdraw, her visits becoming less frequent, her calls unanswered. I suspect she realized that her victory had been an illusion from the start, that no amount of charm or manipulation could overwrite what I had already endured and survived. Mark, on the other hand, seemed trapped in a limbo of guilt and longing, watching as I carved out a world that excluded him emotionally, even while we were bound together by our children. I remember one evening vividly. I had put the babies down for the night, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitors. I sank into the couch, exhaustion and relief washing over me in equal measure. That's when Mark entered the room, hesitating at the doorway. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his choices. "Lila, I want to make things right. I don't want to lose you or them." His voice cracked, a mixture of desperation and guilt. But I had nothing left to give him, not as a lover, not as a confidant, and certainly not as a passive participant in a life he had betrayed. "You lost yourself a long time ago, Mark," I said quietly, my hands gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "And you thought she could fill the space that only trust can occupy. But trust isn't replaceable. It can't be borrowed or bought, and it certainly can't be stolen." I wanted him to understand, to feel the gravity of his choices, but I also knew that no words could reverse the damage. The only thing I could control was what came next, how I built a life for my children without letting his mistakes define them. The weeks passed, and slowly the dynamic shifted further. Vanessa began to withdraw, her visits becoming less frequent, her calls unanswered. I suspect she realized that her victory had been an illusion from the start, that no amount of charm or manipulation could overwrite what I had already endured and survived. Mark, on the other hand, seemed trapped in a limbo of guilt and longing, watching as I carved out a world that excluded him emotionally, even while we were bound together by our children. I remember one evening vividly. I had put the babies down for the night, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitors. I sank into the couch, exhaustion and relief washing over me in equal measure. That's when Mark entered the room, hesitating at the doorway. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his choices. "Lila, I want to make things right. I don't want to lose you or them." His voice cracked, a mixture of desperation and guilt. But I had nothing left to give him, not as a lover, not as a confidant, and certainly not as a passive participant in a life he had betrayed. "You lost yourself a long time ago, Mark," I said quietly, my hands gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "And you thought she could fill the space that only trust can occupy. But trust isn't replaceable. It can't be borrowed or bought, and it certainly can't be stolen." I wanted him to understand, to feel the gravity of his choices, but I also knew that no words could reverse the damage. The only thing I could control was what came next, how I built a life for my children without letting his mistakes define them. The weeks passed, and slowly the dynamic shifted further. Vanessa began to withdraw, her visits becoming less frequent, her calls unanswered. I suspect she realized that her victory had been an illusion from the start, that no amount of charm or manipulation could overwrite what I had already endured and survived. Mark, on the other hand, seemed trapped in a limbo of guilt and longing, watching as I carved out a world that excluded him emotionally, even while we were bound together by our children. I remember one evening vividly. I had put the babies down for the night, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitors. I sank into the couch, exhaustion and relief washing over me in equal measure. That's when Mark entered the room, hesitating at the doorway. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his choices. "Lila, I want to make things right. I don't want to lose you or them." His voice cracked, a mixture of desperation and guilt. But I had nothing left to give him, not as a lover, not as a confidant, and certainly not as a passive participant in a life he had betrayed. "You lost yourself a long time ago, Mark," I said quietly, my hands gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "And you thought she could fill the space that only trust can occupy. But trust isn't replaceable. It can't be borrowed or bought, and it certainly can't be stolen." I wanted him to understand, to feel the gravity of his choices, but I also knew that no words could reverse the damage. The only thing I could control was what came next, how I built a life for my children without letting his mistakes define them. The weeks passed, and slowly the dynamic shifted further. Vanessa began to withdraw, her visits becoming less frequent, her calls unanswered. I suspect she realized that her victory had been an illusion from the start, that no amount of charm or manipulation could overwrite what I had already endured and survived. Mark, on the other hand, seemed trapped in a limbo of guilt and longing, watching as I carved out a world that excluded him emotionally, even while we were bound together by our children. I remember one evening vividly. I had put the babies down for the night, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitors. I sank into the couch, exhaustion and relief washing over me in equal measure. That's when Mark entered the room, hesitating at the doorway. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his choices. "Lila, I want to make things right. I don't want to lose you or them." His voice cracked, a mixture of desperation and guilt. But I had nothing left to give him, not as a lover, not as a confidant, and certainly not as a passive participant in a life he had betrayed. "You lost yourself a long time ago, Mark," I said quietly, my hands gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. And even after the court ruling, life didn't suddenly become easy. There's a misconception that once justice is served, peace automatically follows. It doesn't. Healing is gradual, like a tide that ebbs and flows unpredictably. I spent countless nights awake, rocking my triplets in the dim glow of the nursery light, whispering to them about the love that would always be their anchor, even when the world seemed confusing or cruel. Their tiny hands curling around my fingers reminded me why I had endured everything: the betrayal, the heartbreak, the fear. They were living proof that life could still be beautiful even after unimaginable pain. Mark's attempts to reinsert himself into our lives became more calculated. He followed the visitation schedule to the letter, but I could feel his gaze, always evaluating, always weighing. I often wondered if he fully understood the consequences of his actions, if he realized that his affair had cost him more than he could ever regain. Vanessa, I later discovered through subtle hospital whispers and mutual acquaintances, had quietly disappeared from their lives, not entirely, but enough to realize her plans had failed. She had misjudged my resilience and the bond between me and my children. It was during one of those quiet nights, when the house finally felt like it belonged solely to us, that I truly reflected on what had happened. I realized that I had survived not because I was strong in the conventional sense, but because I allowed myself to feel every emotion fully: grief, anger, fear, and eventually love. Each emotion was a step in rebuilding the life that had been threatened by betrayal. And for my triplets, I needed to continue walking that path with integrity, even if it meant confronting my own vulnerability over and over again. Mark, surprisingly, began to show signs of real remorse, not the shallow apologies of the past, but moments of quiet acknowledgement. One evening, he stayed after dropping the children at daycare. I didn't expect him to speak, but he did. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Lila. I know that now, but I want to try to be a better father for them." His voice was subdued, almost fragile, stripped of its old arrogance. I nodded quietly. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for my peace and for the stability of the children. I had to find a way to coexist with the man who had hurt me without letting him control my life or their innocence. There were days that were harder than others: feeding schedules, sleepless nights, and the constant pressure of being both mother and protector sometimes felt unbearable. But then a small miracle would remind me why I persisted. A laugh from my daughter, a new word from one of the boys, or a tiny hand reaching for mine. These were the moments that reinforced the life I had fought so hard to keep intact. In those moments, I realized that strength isn't always about confrontation or victory. It's about consistency, endurance, and unwavering love. Vanessa's presence, though diminished, still lingered in subtle ways. She attempted social media manipulations, tagging Mark in posts that suggested a new happy life while carefully excluding me. There were messages, some polite, some passive-aggressive, trying to provoke responses from him or even me. But I had learned a crucial lesson. Her power existed only in the attention I gave her. Ignoring her wasn't passive, it was strategy. Every time I refused to react, I regained a little more control over my life and my narrative. One afternoon, a surprising confrontation happened. I was picking up the children from daycare when I spotted Vanessa standing near the gate. She looked the same, polished, confident, but there was an edge of desperation I hadn't noticed before. She tried to smile at me, to engage in small talk, but I didn't allow her in. "The children are fine, that's all that matters," I said firmly, keeping my eyes on them. Her smile faltered, and in that moment I understood something vital. She had assumed she could influence our world, but the reality of my resilience was something she hadn't accounted for. Mark and I began to navigate our new reality with caution. We weren't friends, not yet, and perhaps not ever in the way we once were, but we were partners in a sense that mattered most for our children. The boundaries we established weren't born out of spite, they were born out of necessity to protect the tiny lives that had become the center of our universe. And slowly he started to understand that love isn't just possession or desire, it's responsibility, accountability, and the willingness to confront one's own failures. Months passed, and the children grew. Their personalities began to emerge, and with them a sense of hope and renewal. I watched my daughter mimic my expressions, my boys learn to crawl toward each other, and in every milestone I felt the power of endurance. Despite the betrayal that had threatened to dismantle my life, I had built something unshakable, a family grounded in love, honesty, and resilience. The turning point, however, came when the DNA revelation that had caused so much upheaval began to influence Mark in unexpected ways. He started to distance himself from Vanessa entirely, realizing her ambition and manipulation had no place in the life he truly wanted, a life with his children, even if it meant redefining his relationship with me. There were small gestures, a phone call asking for advice, a cautious involvement in school events, a willingness to participate without overstepping boundaries, that demonstrated a shift in his priorities. He wasn't perfect, and he had much to prove, but at least now he was guided by accountability rather than desire. Through it all, I learned to reclaim my identity. For so long, the betrayal had made me feel powerless, defined only by what I had lost. But in caring for my children, in setting boundaries, and in asserting my own voice, I discovered a version of myself I had never known. I was not just a mother, I was a protector, a strategist, a woman who could endure heartbreak without losing her soul. And in that endurance, I found the unexpected gift of liberation, the freedom to create a life unshaped by fear, betrayal, or expectation. One evening, I sat with my children on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. Their tiny hands intertwined with mine, and I whispered stories of the world they would inherit, stories of resilience, love, and truth. I told them about the mistakes of the past, not as a warning steeped in anger, but as lessons framed in understanding. Life isn't perfect, I said softly. Sometimes people hurt you. Sometimes people make mistakes. But you can always choose how to respond. You can always choose love. And in that moment, I understood fully what was at stake all along. Vanessa had assumed she could win by taking from me, by undermining my life and my marriage, but she had misjudged my resilience, the power of truth, and the bond I shared with my children. The DNA test had merely confirmed what I had already known in my heart, that life, no matter how fragile, is stronger than deceit. I also realized that healing is not linear. There were days of anger, days of tears, days when I questioned whether the effort to maintain stability was worth it. But every time I looked at my triplets, every tiny smile, every grasp of my fingers, I remembered why I endured. They were living proof that even when someone tries to rewrite your story, you can still hold the pen. As the months stretched into a year, Vanessa faded further into memory, her presence reduced to whispers and rumors. Mark continued to navigate his new role, learning, failing, and slowly improving, not for my forgiveness, but for the sake of the children. And I, Lila, emerged from the storm not just intact, but empowered. I had endured heartbreak, survived betrayal, and reclaimed the life that had been threatened. And in that reclamation, I discovered the most profound truth. Love, Honesty and perseverance are more powerful than any illusion of control. Even as life settled into a new rhythm, I realized that the real challenge wasn't just surviving betrayal, it was learning to live fully again. The first year after giving birth to triplets is relentless under any circumstances, but add a fractured marriage and the shadow of a mistress, and exhaustion becomes almost a physical presence. There were days I wondered if I would ever feel normal again, if my heart could stop aching in the quiet moments when the house was still and the children slept. But slowly, life began to feel like more than survival. It began to feel like possibility. I discovered strength I didn't know I had. Changing diapers at 3 in the morning, soothing cries that seemed endless, and juggling doctor's appointments, feedings, and everything else, I realized I could do things I'd never imagined. And even in my exhaustion, there were moments of beauty. My daughter's first laugh, the boys crawling toward each other, their tiny hands clinging to mine as they learned the world was safe when I was near. These moments reminded me that what I had endured, every pang of betrayal and every sleepless night, was worth it. Mark's presence remained complicated. He was involved, but carefully. I never let him dictate the household or the rules. Our interactions were polite but distant, a delicate balance of necessity and self-protection. Some days I could see remorse flicker in his eyes. Sometimes it was brief, sometimes lingering, but I realized that I couldn't depend on him to fix what had been broken. That responsibility belonged to me, and the more I leaned into that role, the more I realized I was capable of building a life that didn't require validation from anyone who had betrayed me. Vanessa, in contrast, had practically vanished from our immediate lives. She still lingered in the background through social media and occasional mutual acquaintances, but her attempts to insert herself into our story had lost their potency. She had assumed she could intimidate me, manipulate Mark, and rewrite the narrative of my life, but the DNA test had shifted the balance of power irrevocably. She had miscalculated the depth of my resolve, and in that miscalculation, I found a quiet satisfaction. Not revenge, exactly, more a sense of justice served by the mere fact that her assumptions about my weakness had been entirely wrong. One day, about 6 months after the birth of the triplets, I had an unexpected moment of reflection. I was sitting in the nursery, feeding the baby girl while the boys played nearby, and it hit me. This was life, fully, raw, messy, and beautiful. I could feel the weight of the past months, all the fear and pain, and yet it no longer consumed me. I was present, I was capable, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't in months: hope. It wasn't long after that moment that I received a phone call from Mark's office. He wanted to discuss something important. I agreed, cautiously, expecting perhaps another apology or some awkward attempt at reconciliation. Instead, he surprised me. "Lila, I've been thinking," he began, voice low. "I want to make amends, not just for me, but for them. I want to do better. I need to do better." There was no grand confession, no desperate attempt to pull me back into his life. It was simple, earnest, and strangely calming. I realized that this was the man I had married, not the man who betrayed me, but the one capable of learning from his mistakes. We established new boundaries together. Visitation schedules became clearer, expectations were set, and slowly a new form of co-parenting took shape. It wasn't easy. Some days old resentments resurfaced. Some days I felt anger boiling beneath the surface. But each time I reminded myself that my children deserved stability above all else. I refused to allow past betrayals to destabilize the family we were trying to rebuild. Even with progress, I couldn't deny the lingering fear that Vanessa might attempt to intervene again. I stayed vigilant, not out of obsession, but as a necessary measure to protect my children. I documented everything, kept records of communication, and maintained the household as a fortress of love and order. Every time she reached out, it became clear that her attempts were futile. The children were safe, my voice was heard, and slowly she receded further into irrelevance. It was during this period that I began to reflect more on myself, my own desires, my own needs, and my own identity. For so long, the focus had been on surviving betrayal, protecting the children, and navigating Mark's fluctuating remorse. But I realized I had neglected myself. I began to carve out time for small things, reading, journaling, even reconnecting with friends I had neglected. These moments weren't indulgent, they were necessary. They reminded me that I was not just a mother or a victim of betrayal. I was a human being deserving of care, attention, and growth. The triplets grew quickly. Every milestone became a source of joy, a small victory in a life that it felt so uncertain. I celebrated their first words, first steps, first laughter shared between siblings. And as they grew, I noticed something remarkable. Their personalities were distinct, yet deeply connected. The boys were adventurous, always challenging each other and testing limits, while their sister had a quiet, observant intelligence that often left me in awe. Watching them interact, I realized that no matter what had happened in the past, I had created something unshakable, a family grounded in love and resilience. Mark's presence became easier to navigate over time. He showed glimpses of genuine change, participating in school events, learning to manage the children's needs, and even apologizing to them in small ways for the mistakes of the past. He wasn't perfect, and I made no illusions about that, but there was a growing sense that he understood the gravity of his past choices. And more importantly, he began to respect the boundaries I had set, recognizing that control was no longer his to wield. Vanessa's attempts to reach him or manipulate the situation diminished entirely. I realized that the DNA test, which had initially felt like a small medical precaution, had become a turning point in our lives. It had shattered her assumptions, exposed the truth, and restored a sense of balance. She had underestimated me, underestimated my strength, and underestimated the bond I shared with my children. In that underestimation, I found not just relief, but empowerment. One evening, as I tucked the triplets into bed, I reflected on everything that had happened. The pain, the betrayal, the sleepless nights, they had all led to this moment. My children were safe, I was healing, and the people who had once threatened our peace had lost their power. I realized that the story of my life was no longer dictated by others. It was written by my choices, my resilience, and my unwavering commitment to the ones I loved most. I thought about the lessons I had learned. Betrayal can never define you, resilience can emerge from the deepest pain, and truth has a way of asserting itself even when deception seems strongest. And as I looked at my sleeping children, I understood something profound. The measure of a family isn't the absence of hardship, but the courage to endure hardship together with love intact. The years ahead would not be without challenges. Raising triplets alone, or even with Mark's careful involvement, was a life of constant responsibility and growth. But I was ready. I had survived the impossible, faced betrayal with courage, and emerged stronger than I had ever been. And in that strength, I found peace, hope, and the unshakable knowledge that no one could take away what truly mattered: the love I had nurtured, the bond I had forged with my children, and the life I had reclaimed from the shadows of deception. Life after the court hearings settled into a rhythm, but it was far from ordinary. The triplets were growing rapidly, each day filled with both joy and chaos. Feeding schedules, playtime, and school activities demanded all my attention. Yet with each passing day, I felt more grounded, more in control, and more certain of my place in the world. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, but the laughter of my children, the warmth of their small hands in mine, and their curious little voices reminded me that every sleepless night, every tear shed, had been worth it. Mark tried to find his place in this new reality. He participated in school functions, helped with doctor appointments, and tried to learn the ropes of fatherhood in a way that respected my boundaries. I still watched him cautiously, aware of how easily trust could be broken. But slowly, I began to see glimpses of genuine change. He had been forced to confront his choices, and for the first time, I saw accountability in action. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was something. Vanessa, on the other hand, had mostly disappeared from the picture. Her attempts to manipulate or reassert control over our lives had been rendered powerless by the DNA test, the court rulings, and my unwavering resolve. I occasionally heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to another city, likely realizing that the life she had envisioned with Mark and my children was never hers to claim. There was a quiet satisfaction in that knowledge, not born of malice, but from the sense that truth had prevailed, and justice, however delayed, had been served. Despite the progress, emotional scars lingered. There were nights when I would sit in the darkened nursery after putting the children to bed, letting the weight of the past months wash over me. I thought about the betrayal, the lies, and the fear that had almost consumed me. I thought about the moments I had questioned my strength and my ability to endure. But then I would look at the sleeping faces of my triplets, and the anxiety and sorrow would be replaced with gratitude and resolve. I had survived, and now I had the power to shape their future. One day, a small but significant event occurred that reminded me of the unpredictability of life. I was in the park, pushing the boys on the swings while my daughter toddled behind me, and I noticed a woman observing us from across the playground. At first, I tensed, fearing it might be Vanessa or someone with ill intent. But as I watched, I realized she was simply a mother, smiling at her children and enjoying a moment of peace. And in that moment, I understood something essential. Peace isn't guaranteed by removing threats or eliminating past mistakes. It's a state cultivated within through awareness, boundaries, and love. Mark and I had to learn to communicate without letting the past poison every interaction. He made mistakes, of course, forgotten appointments, miscommunications, and moments of defensiveness, but I responded with calm clarity rather than anger. I established clear expectations, set firm boundaries, and reminded him that the priority was our children's well-being. Slowly, we developed a functional, though unconventional, partnership, a co-parenting relationship built on necessity, accountability, and the shared love for our children. The triplets' personalities flourished in this environment. My daughter developed an early curiosity for books and stories, often sitting with a picture book in her tiny lap, while her brothers explored the world with endless energy and imagination. Watching them grow, I realized that resilience wasn't just something I had cultivated in myself, it was a gift I was now nurturing in them. They were learning, through the security of our home, that love is enduring, honesty is vital, and strength can be quiet yet formidable. One evening, Mark approached me with an unusual request. "Lila, I want to do something special for them," he said, hesitating slightly. "I want to plan a small family trip, just the 5 of us. No distractions, no work, just us." I studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time I allowed myself to say yes, not because I had forgiven him entirely, but because I wanted my children to experience what it meant to have both parents present, even imperfectly. The trip, modest and simple, became a turning point. We spent a weekend in a cabin by a quiet lake, and for the first time, the tension that had always hovered around Mark's presence softened. The children laughed freely, played together without interruption, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. Mark participated without trying to control or dominate, respecting the boundaries I had set. And in those small moments, I realized that healing doesn't always require reconciliation. It often requires presence, consistency, and the courage to let go of past expectations. Despite these small victories, I remained vigilant. Vanessa's potential return, while unlikely, was a reality I could not ignore. I reinforced routines, documented interactions meticulously, and ensured that every legal safeguard remained in place. This vigilance wasn't born of fear, it was born of responsibility. My children's safety and emotional well-being were paramount, and I would not compromise them for convenience or comfort. As the triplets grew older, I began to notice subtle changes in Mark. He was less defensive, more patient, and increasingly aware of the consequences of his past actions. He began to participate in their milestones with genuine enthusiasm, celebrating achievements without overshadowing the love and care I provided. I still held him accountable, of course, but there was a sense of mutual respect emerging, a fragile yet promising foundation that didn't erase the past, but acknowledged the possibility of a more stable future. Vanessa remained in the background, her influence diminished, but the lessons she had inadvertently taught me lingered. I realized that betrayal often reveals hidden strengths, both in oneself and in those we love. It forces clarity, resilience, and the ability to distinguish between what is essential and what is fleeting. And in that realization, I found a profound sense of empowerment. I had survived, I had protected my children, and I had reclaimed the narrative of our lives from those who sought to distort it. One quiet afternoon, as the triplets played in the living room, I reflected on how far we had come. The months of turmoil, the sleepless nights, the legal battles, and the emotional roller coaster had all led to this moment. Our home was filled with laughter, energy, and the promise of growth. And I realized that life, even after betrayal, could still be rich with joy, love, and purpose. I thought about the future and the lessons I wanted to impart to my children. I would teach them about honesty, resilience, and the importance of boundaries. I would show them that mistakes, while inevitable, do not define a person's worth. And most importantly, I would remind them that love is not about possession or control. It is about presence, accountability, and unwavering care. As night fell and the children drifted to sleep, I sat in the dim light, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I had endured heartbreak, navigated betrayal, and emerged stronger than I had ever imagined. Mark and I had established a functional co-parenting relationship, Vanessa's influence had faded, and my children were thriving in a home filled with love and stability. And in that quiet reflection, I understood a profound truth. Life will inevitably present challenges, betrayals, and moments of deep pain, but those who endure, who protect what is sacred, and who act with integrity can reclaim their lives. They can create a future where love, resilience, and truth prevail over deception, manipulation, and fear. I had done all of that, not perfectly, but fully, and with every ounce of my heart devoted to the children who were my anchor, my motivation, and my greatest source of strength. And as I watched them sleep peacefully, I knew that the story of our lives was no longer dictated by the shadows of betrayal. It was defined by the love, courage, and determination that had carried us through the storm. Life, as I came to understand, doesn't reward perfection, it rewards perseverance. By the time my triplets were nearly 2, I had learned that patience was as essential as love, and resilience often meant continuing quietly when the world expected me to break. Every day brought new challenges, spilled milk, tantrums, endless messes, and moments of sheer exhaustion. But it also brought unmeasurable joy, the first words of each child, the first wobbly steps, and the laughter that filled our home in unplanned bursts. These small moments became my sustenance, reminders that despite betrayal, life could still be beautiful. Mark's attempts to reconnect had evolved slowly. At first, I had resisted every effort. I didn't want our children to see a reunion of hearts that had once been fractured. But gradually, I realized that a measured presence of their father, accountable, respectful, and honest, was valuable to their development. He attended school events, helped with play dates, and occasionally managed to get them dressed and ready on time without my interference. It was imperfect and at times frustrating, but it showed growth. He was learning, albeit slowly, that parenthood is not about control, it's about responsibility and consistency. Vanessa's absence remained a quiet relief. I occasionally saw glimpses of her on social media, always attempting to portray a glamorous, victorious life, yet I had no stake in her narrative anymore. The DNA test, the court proceedings, and my steadfast resolve had effectively stripped her of power. What remained was a quiet sense of justice, not vengeance, but the simple knowledge that truth had prevailed and she could no longer manipulate our lives. In some strange way, her retreat reminded me that sometimes the best retribution is simply living well despite those who tried to hurt you. I began to rebuild my own life outside the confines of motherhood and betrayal. I took small steps, returning to work part-time, reconnecting with friends, even allowing myself moments of leisure. These moments were not indulgent, they were restorative. I realized that to care fully for my children, I needed to care for myself as well. My resilience had brought us through the worst, but my growth, both emotional and personal, would ensure that we thrived in the years to come. One afternoon, as I was organizing the children's toys, Mark approached me quietly. "Lila, I want to talk," he said, his voice steady but soft. I braced myself, unsure whether this was another plea or a genuine conversation. He continued, "I know I've caused irreparable damage, and I accept that, but I want to find a way to be a father they can rely on, a presence that doesn't destabilize their lives." There was no defensiveness, no excuse-making, just accountability. For the first time, I felt the possibility of a functional, cooperative partnership with him, not as lovers, but as parents committed to a shared responsibility. We agreed on a new approach, co-parenting with clarity, boundaries, and shared accountability. We divided responsibilities, established clear communication protocols, and made decisions together regarding schooling, medical care, and discipline. There were moments of tension, moments where the past threatened to resurface, but we approached each conflict with a focus on the children rather than old wounds. Slowly, a new pattern emerged, one that balanced care, consistency, and respect. Raising triplets is, by itself, a monumental task. Each child had unique needs and personality traits. My daughter was curious, introspective, and often surprisingly perceptive for her age. My sons were adventurous, testing limits, and constantly seeking attention from each other and from me. Managing their distinct personalities required vigilance, patience, and creativity, but it also revealed an unexpected truth. Resilience is contagious. The more I adapted and thrived, the more my children absorbed those lessons, developing confidence, empathy, and the ability to navigate challenges in their own ways. During one particularly chaotic afternoon, the boys got into a minor scuffle over toys, and my daughter began crying. I took a deep breath and guided them gently but firmly, helping them navigate conflict and teaching them empathy, sharing, and communication. In that moment, I realized that the lessons I had learned through betrayal, patience, accountability, and resilience were now becoming life lessons for them. The pain I had endured was not wasted. It had been transformed into wisdom that would shape my children's lives for years to come. Mark's behavior, while improved, was not without flaws. He occasionally overstepped boundaries or allowed frustration to cloud his judgment, but each time I responded with calm, assertive clarity, ensuring the children remained the priority. And over time, he adapted. He began to understand that parenthood is not about being right or proving dominance. It is about presence, patience, and consistent love. The contrast between his past arrogance and his current efforts was stark, and in observing his growth, I felt a cautious optimism. Vanessa, of course, continued to exist as a distant shadow. I knew she might try to intrude at some point, whether through Mark or through social circles, but I had fortified my life against her influence. I had built a home, a routine, and a mindset that could not easily be destabilized by her presence. My power had returned, not through confrontation, but through steadfast action, clarity, and the simple act of prioritizing my children and myself above all else. One evening, after the children were asleep, I reflected on how far we had come. From the moment I discovered Mark's affair to the DNA test revelation, the birth of my triplets, the court battles, and the months of rebuilding, I had navigated a storm that could have destroyed me. And yet, here I was, intact, resilient, and capable of creating a life filled with love, stability, and hope. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I had reclaimed my narrative, and with it the future of my family. I began to recognize that the greatest strength lies not in avoiding pain, but in enduring it and emerging with clarity, courage, and compassion. Betrayal had forced me to confront my own limits and fears, but it had also revealed my capacity for resilience and love. Each challenge, each sleepless night, and each confrontation with Mark or the shadow of Vanessa had contributed to a newfound self-awareness, a sense of empowerment that no betrayal could take away. The triplets' laughter, growing independence, and joyful curiosity became constant reminders of what mattered most. Their needs, personalities, and development required vigilance and love, but also offered unparalleled rewards. I marveled at the resilience I had cultivated in them, shaped not only by my guidance, but also by the example of how I navigated life's betrayals. They were learning that challenges can be faced with courage, that love requires effort, and that integrity matters even when others fail to honor it. As the months passed, I found myself increasingly able to focus on the long-term future. I planned for their education, established routines that encouraged emotional intelligence, and built a support network that ensured my children and I would never be isolated. This forward-looking perspective was a direct contrast to the chaos and uncertainty that had dominated the first months of their lives. Where there had been once fear and betrayal, there was now clarity, stability, and purpose. Through it all, I realized a profound truth. Betrayal, no matter how painful, can be transformative. It forces reflection, strengthens resolve, and illuminates what truly matters. I had been pushed to my limits, and in that process, I discovered an inner strength I never knew existed. I also discovered that love, when grounded in truth and commitment, is far more enduring than deceit or manipulation. And so I continued, day after day, nurturing my children, guiding their growth, and cultivating a life defined not by past heartbreak, but by the choices I made in the present. Mark's role remained complex, yet functional. Vanessa had faded from our lives entirely, and I had reclaimed not only my home, but my identity. I was no longer defined by betrayal. I was defined by resilience, love, and the unwavering commitment to protect and nurture the lives I had brought into the world. By the time my triplets were approaching 3 years old, life had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt manageable, even comforting. The chaos of infancy had evolved into the constant motion of toddlers, endless questions, boundless energy, and the discovery of personalities so distinct it left me both exhausted and in awe. My daughter was sharp, observant, and fiercely independent, while my sons were fearless, playful, and mischievous in equal measure. Their presence reminded me every day that the most powerful thing I had ever done was bring them into the world and then protect them with everything I had. Mark, for his part, had adjusted to his role as their father. He wasn't the man I had once loved blindly, but he was learning to exist within boundaries that prioritized our children. He was less defensive, more willing to listen, and increasingly aware of how his past decisions had shaped our present reality. He still had moments of frustration, moments where old patterns threatened to resurface, but I met those moments with calm resolve. Our interactions were no longer about passion or betrayal. They were about structure, respect, and the children's emotional well-being. Vanessa, on the other hand, remained an afterthought in our lives. Though I occasionally glimpsed hints of her presence online or heard of her social escapades through distant acquaintances, I felt no fear, no desire to engage. Her power had always existed outside of me, borrowed from Mark's weakness and my own silence. Now that both of those factors were gone, she had nothing to influence. The DNA test, the court decisions, and my steadfast focus on my children had rendered her threats meaningless. It was a revelation I carried quietly within me. Sometimes the strongest form of justice is simply living well while others fade into irrelevance. One evening, as the triplets played on the living room floor, I reflected on the journey we had endured. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, they all felt like a lifetime ago, yet their impact remained etched in my consciousness. I remembered the first time I had seen Vanessa with Mark, the cold realization that my life was no longer my own, and the despair that followed the initial months of pregnancy. And yet, through every challenge, every tear, every sleepless night, I had endured, I had survived, and in surviving, I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. Mark entered the room quietly, holding a tray with warm milk for the children. He smiled awkwardly, as he often did now, a quiet humility in his posture. "They're growing so fast," he said, watching the children scramble across the floor. "It feels like yesterday they were in the hospital." I nodded, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Yes, those early months had been unbearable, but we had made it through. And in that survival, I had reclaimed not just my life, but the narrative of my family. Our conversations had become practical, centered on the children rather than emotions. Decisions about school, health, and schedules were deliberate, sometimes tense, but always productive. I no longer feared his influence, not because he had disappeared from their lives, but because I had established boundaries strong enough to ensure the children's stability. That, I realized, was the ultimate measure of strength, the ability to protect what you love even when the past threatens to intrude. Despite this stability, life wasn't without its challenges. The triplets' growth brought new complexities. Discipline required patience, negotiation, and a careful balance of attention. Arguments between the boys could escalate quickly, while my daughter often needed extra reassurance and guidance. I found myself navigating these dynamics with a calm assertiveness I hadn't possessed before, shaped by the experiences of the past 2 years. Every challenge became an opportunity to reinforce resilience, empathy, and integrity. Then came the moment that shifted everything again, unexpected, sudden, and profoundly emotional. A routine pediatric checkup suggested the possibility of a minor medical issue that required further testing. As I sat in the clinic, holding my children close, a nurse approached with envelopes containing the test results. My hands trembled as I opened them, bracing myself for bad news, but what I found instead was confirmation of something else entirely, a detail in the paperwork that revealed the DNA sequencing for all 3 children, reaffirming not only their paternity, but the impossibility of any outside influence. Vanessa's assumptions, her belief that she could disrupt our lives, had been definitively disproven. My children were ours, and no external interference could change that fact. I left the clinic that day with a renewed sense of clarity. The DNA test, which had initially been a tool for verification, now served as a symbol of resilience and truth. Vanessa's shadow had been permanently eclipsed by honesty and endurance. Mark, who accompanied me that day, seemed visibly humbled, not with arrogance, but with quiet understanding. He finally grasped the magnitude of his mistakes and the magnitude of what had been at stake. As the months unfolded, I began to notice subtle but profound changes in my children. They were growing in confidence, in empathy, and in understanding the concept of family. Even at their young age, they seemed to sense the lessons embedded in their upbringing, that love is patient, that truth is enduring, and that strength often manifests quietly in the face of adversity. I felt a deep pride, a sense of accomplishment that transcended the ordinary. I had not just survived betrayal, I had transformed it into a foundation for growth, love, and security. Mark and I continued to navigate our complicated partnership. We celebrated small victories, a school performance, a birthday party, a successful visit with extended family. Each success reinforced the reality that while our marriage could not be restored to what it once was, our ability to co-parent effectively had become a triumph in itself. And through these moments, I realized something essential. Forgiveness is not always about reconciliation. Sometimes it is about creating peace within yourself while ensuring stability for those you love. One evening, as I tucked the triplets into bed, I reflected on everything we had endured. The heartbreak, the sleepless nights, the betrayal, the legal battles. It had all led to this moment of quiet triumph. My children were safe, thriving, and enveloped in love. Mark had accepted responsibility and was learning to be present without overstepping. Vanessa's influence had been neutralized, her power nullified by the steadfastness of truth and endurance, and I, for the first time in years, felt unshakable, not because life had been easy, but because I had faced its most brutal challenges and emerged resilient. I whispered to the triplets, my voice soft and full of emotion. Life will always have challenges. People may disappoint you, and situations may feel unfair, but you will always have each other, and you will always have love. That love will carry you through anything. As they drifted into sleep, I understood that this lesson was not just for them, it was for me as well. I had learned it through hardship, heartbreak, and endurance, and now I carried it forward with clarity, purpose, and strength. The past, I realized, could not define the future. Betrayal, while painful, had illuminated hidden reservoirs of strength, compassion, and resilience within me. The DNA test, the court proceedings, and the months of vigilance were not just battles, they were instruments through which I discovered the depth of my own courage. And now, looking at the peaceful faces of my children, I knew that every challenge had been worth it. As the years stretched onward, the lessons of this period would continue to guide me. I would teach my children to honor truth, to respect boundaries, and to cultivate resilience. I would model strength not through anger or revenge, but through calm, deliberate action and unwavering commitment to what truly mattered. And in doing so, I would ensure that the legacy of betrayal and hardship would be transformed into a legacy of love, integrity, and enduring courage. The journey had not been easy. It had demanded every ounce of patience, every shred of emotional strength, and a willingness to confront both external betrayal and my own internal fears. But through it all, I had endured. I had nurtured life, protected it, and shaped it into something meaningful. And as I watched my children sleep, I felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that the story of our lives was now ours to write, free from manipulation, grounded in truth, and overflowing with love. The shadows of betrayal had passed, leaving only clarity and resilience. And in that clarity, I found the most powerful truth of all. Even when others try to take what is yours, even when they believe they have won,
Endurance, courage, and love will always prevail. And now, as I reflect on the journey, I wonder if you would like me to continue with the final part where the ultimate revelation unfolds and the story finds its emotional closure.
By the time the triplets turned 4, the storm that once defined my life had softened into something distant, almost unrecognizable. The pain was no longer sharp. It had become a memory, a lesson woven into the fabric of who I was. Our home was alive with noise, tiny feet running down hallways, spontaneous laughter, arguments over crayons and bedtime stories. The chaos was constant, but it was the kind of chaos that felt safe. It was ours. There was a moment, not long after their birthday, when I stood in the kitchen watching them play in the backyard. The sun was low, golden light catching in their curls, their giggles floating through the open window. Mark was outside with them, kneeling in the grass as one of the boys attempted to teach him the rules of a made-up game. My daughter stood nearby, hands on her hips, issuing instructions like a tiny commander, and I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at him, not at Vanessa, not even at the past. I had carried that anger like armor for so long, believing it protected me, but somewhere between court hearings, DNA confirmations, sleepless nights, and toddler milestones, I had outgrown it. The anger had served its purpose. It had fueled my survival, but it no longer defined me. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Vanessa reached out. Not through social media, not through Mark, but directly to me. She sent a simple email requesting a conversation. No manipulation, no accusations, just a request. For a long time, I stared at the message. I felt the old memories stir, the old defensive instincts rise. But I also felt something else. Curiosity, maybe, even closure waiting to happen. After careful thought, I agreed to meet her in a public cafe, not because I owed her anything, but because I wanted to walk into that meeting without fear. When I saw her sitting there, she looked different, not defeated, not triumphant, just human. She didn't smile the way she used to. There was no arrogance in her posture. When I sat down, she spoke first. "I was wrong," she said quietly, "about everything." She admitted that she believed Mark would leave me completely. She believed the children would complicate things and push him toward her. She believed she could outmaneuver me emotionally. But the DNA test, the legal boundaries, and most of all, my refusal to collapse under pressure had dismantled her illusions. "You didn't fight me," she said. "You built your life anyway, and that's what I couldn't compete with." For the first time, I saw clearly what had been true all along. She never truly won anything. She had been chasing validation from a man who didn't fully understand himself, while I had been fighting for something infinitely more important, my children's stability, their future, and my own dignity. I didn't forgive her in that cafe. Forgiveness isn't always spoken out loud, but I did release her. I released the hold her memory had once had on me. I walked out of that meeting lighter than I had walked in. When I returned home, the triplets ran to me, wrapping their arms around my legs. Mark looked up from the floor where he was helping build a block tower. "Everything okay?" he asked carefully, and I smiled. Everything's exactly as it should be. Mark and I never rekindled our marriage. That chapter had ended the moment trust dissolved. But we built something different, something rooted in accountability and shared devotion to our children. Over time, we learned to communicate without reopening wounds. We learned that co-parenting doesn't require romance, it requires maturity. The ultimate revelation, the one that changed everything, wasn't actually the DNA test itself. It wasn't the courtroom decision. It wasn't Vanessa's defeat. It was this: my power never left me. The DNA test didn't give me strength. It revealed the truth that had always existed. My children were secure in their identity. My family was legitimate. My role was unshakable. What changed wasn't biology. It was perspective. Vanessa believed she had won because she thought love was possession. She thought marriage was something you could step into and replace. But she misunderstood something fundamental. Love built on betrayal cannot sustain itself, and motherhood, true motherhood, is not something anyone can steal. Years later, when my triplets were old enough to ask complicated questions about why their parents lived in separate houses, I answered them honestly but gently. Sometimes adults make mistakes, I told them, but what matters most is that we choose to do better afterwards. They accepted that answer with the simplicity only children possessed. To them, family wasn't defined by one roof or perfect history. It was defined by presence, and both Mark and I, in our own imperfect ways, were present. One evening, after tucking them into bed, I lingered in the doorway. I watched their steady breathing, their peaceful expressions, and I allowed myself to revisit the woman I had once been, the pregnant wife standing in a boutique, heart shattering as she discovered her husband's betrayal. That woman had felt powerless. She had believed everything was slipping away. If I could speak to her now, I would say this: hold on. You are stronger than this moment. The pain you feel will not destroy you. It will shape you. Because it did. The mistress thought she had won. She thought she had taken my husband, destabilized my home, and rewritten my future. But she underestimated something powerful: the quiet, relentless strength of a mother protecting her children. She underestimated the power of truth, and she underestimated me. In the end, there was no dramatic revenge, no public humiliation, no grand confrontation. There was only steady endurance, legal documentation, DNA results, boundaries, growth, and love. That love, patient, persistent, and unyielding, became the foundation upon which everything else was rebuilt. Today, when I look at my life, I don't see betrayal first. I see resilience. I see children thriving in security. I see a father who learned accountability the hard way. I see a woman who discovered her own strength not through comfort, but through fire. The moral of my story isn't that DNA tests solve everything. It isn't that mistresses always lose. It's this: when someone tries to take what is yours through deception, your greatest defense is not rage. It is integrity. When you stand firm in truth, when you protect what matters without losing yourself, the illusions of others eventually collapse under their own weight. The DNA test changed everything because it forced truth into the open, but it was my endurance that transformed that truth into freedom. And now, years later, as I close this chapter of my life, I do so without bitterness. I close it with gratitude for my children, for the lessons, for the strength forged in hardship. Because in the end, the only real victory was that I didn't lose myself, I didn't lose my children, and I didn't let betrayal write the ending of my story. I wrote it myself.